Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. Today, we're going to be learning Mishnah Berurah K Daf Kuf Tez Zayin Amid Beis. However, we begin near the bottom of Kuf Tez Zayin Amid Aleph. In the last share, we left off in the middle of Sif Beis by the words of the Ramah. I'm going to begin reading from the beginning of Sif Beis just so that we can recapture what we were discussing. Says the Mechaber in Sif Beis. Aguda shel eitzim, if you have a bundle of wooden branches, shahudlaka b'medura, that have been lit to be a bonfire. Kol eitz shalai achazabai ha'esh, any piece of wood that has not taken fire, mutter l'shamtai, you're allowed to remove that piece of wood, and you don't have a problem of mechabe, you don't have a problem of extinguishing shalai l'tzarech on Yom Tov. And this is not similar to one who would remove oil from a burning lamp. And if you remember, we explained that what the Mechaber is telling you over here is buy shemen, buy oil in a lamp. The Machlokes is Rishonim precisely why it's usher, but you're not allowed to remove the shemen, you're not allowed to remove the oil from the lamp, because that is considered mechabe, that is considered an act of extinguishing. However, over here, when you have an aguda shel eitzim, where all the wood is tied together over here, if you have a piece of wood that never caught fire, you are allowed to remove it, even though it's all tied together. But if you have a piece of wood in that bundle that is burning, then you're not allowed to remove that piece of wood. Since all of the twigs in this bundle are tied together in one bundle, it's all considered to be one madura, it's all considered to be one burning torch, and if you remove one burning piece of wood, that would be an act of mechabe. Now let's see the words of the Ramah. The Ramah says, Haga, Umutar likach eitz hadolok mitzad zeh shel madura. The Ramah says, if you had this madura, this burning pile of wood, and you want to take a burning twig from one side and to put it on the other side, let's say your fire is not balanced very well, and you want to make it burn better on one side. So you want to take a burning piece of wood from the right side and put it over on the left side. So that the Ramah says you're allowed to do. Since in that case, you certainly don't want to extinguish anything. You're not removing the burning piece of wood because you want to lessen the fire or you want to lessen the light of the fire. No, you just want to reposition it. So even if there's a moment of kivoy over there, when you pull it out and you move it over there, that's a davar she'eina miskaven. And he says, the Ramah says that that's not a problem. Now, there's something that lies in the words of the Ramah over here that you would not pick up unless you looked at the Mishnah Berurah. So let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah is cut in chaf. Says the Mishnah Berurah. The Ramah said you're allowed to take a burning stick from one side of the madura, remove it, and put it onto the other side of the madura. Says the Chavetz Chaim, v'hu hadin im shomtai, same thing would be true if you remove it, and you take it off of there, kedei laha'ir lefanav gam kein shari. Let's say you're not taking the burning stick off one side of the madura to put it on the other side of the madura. No, you're pulling a burning stick off of the fire because you need a flashlight. You're taking a burning stick off of the fire because you need to walk and you need to be able to see your way. Says the Chavetz Chaim, according to the Ramah, that would also be mutter. Why? Because what was the driving rationale behind the words of the Ramah? The Ramah said the reason you're allowed to take a burning stick from one side of the madura and put it on the other side of the madura is because you're not mechaven l'kibui. You have no kavana, you have no intent to extinguish the fire in any way. Well, if I'm taking off a burning stick to use as a flashlight, I also have no kavana for mechabe. Like the Chavetz Chaim says, if he's doing it for that reason, he's not doing it for kibui. V'yesh machmirin bazeh. However, he does bring down here from the Magen Avram that there are those that are machmir and say that this is aser, v'nachon lahachmir, and it would be proper to be machmir. V'tzarech lahazir b'nei beisai. The Chavetz Chaim brings down over here that you should teach and warn the people in your home, kishemevashlim dogim, that when they're cooking little fishes, shala'acha gemara bishul, when the cooking is over. And I think the reason he uses the case of cooking fish is because it's something that cooked very quickly. When the cooking is over, Lo yikchu ha'udim, they should not take out the burning branches. El yanichum lisraif, rather they should just leave them there and let them burn out. Because again, you're not allowed to do kivui for absolutely no reason. So if you finished your cooking, you can't take out the burning twigs and throw them out and put the fire out. You can't do that. You have to just leave them there and let them burn out. Okay. Now we go to Siv Gimel. Ein soimchen es hakidera v'loyes hadeles bebikas. You cannot use a bikas. A bikas is a log. It's a clump of wood. You can't use it to support a pot or to support a door. This bikas is something which is considered muktzeh. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah's cut and chaf aleph. Bebikas, bottom line on kuf tezayin amud aleph. What's the problem here? The eitzim lahasaka hein oimdin, because a bikas, a clump of firewood, is considered a piece of wood that is designated for burning. It's oimed lahasaka. That's what it's muchan for. V'loy l'davar acher, and it's not muchan for anything else. Now, that is a little bit interesting, because what you see over here, this is something that we've played with already before. We mentioned earlier that a keli, a kli shemalachta leheter, if you have a keli that's perfectly usable for a permissible activity on Shabbos or Yom Tov, like a chair is a kli, it's a kli shemalachta leheter. The halacha is that you're allowed to be metaltalit for any use at all. You could use it for anything, not just for sitting on, because since it's a kli shemalachta leheter, it's available for shimush b'nei adam, for a person's usages, for whatever he wants to use it for. Contrast to that, we saw earlier that you cannot burn food. If you have egoizim and shkedim, if you have nuts that are already shelled, we said you're not allowed to burn them. You're not allowed to use them as fuel. Why? Because we said oichlim are not designated for all sorts of use, right? We had that in Siv Zayin. If you take a look on Kuf Tes Vav Amid Beis in Mishnah Berurah Ois Cut and Lamed Aleph, the Mishnah Berurah said over there, you're not allowed to burn the egoizim or the shkedim, the ein muchanim lahasik klal, because those are not considered muchan for burning. She'ein derech klal lahaniach achlin ala eish, because that's not something that you do with food. You don't burn food as fuel. Ma she'ein kain bekalim, so the Mishnah Berurah draw a contrast here between food and kalim. He said, "Kalim, mashein kain bekalim, mipnei tzarich ha'ichlin b'yom tov efshel lahasik l'pam and bekalim pchusim." Somehow, kalim are designated l'shimush b'nei adam for whatever use they want to use them. And the Mishnah Berurah commented over there in Lamed Aleph that we just read that there are times that if you have a cheap, not so good, not so useful keli, you will chuck it in a fire to use it for fuel if you need it for fuel. But the bottom line is that a keli, something that's designated as a keli, is muchan l'shimush b'nei adam for whatever way they want to use it. Oichlim are not. Foodstuffs are not considered to have a blanket status of muchan for any shimush b'nei adam at all. An oichel has a much more focused, specific use. It's a food item, so it's not muchan for burning. We're seeing the same thing over here. We're seeing that a bikas is something that is considered muchan. It's oimed lahasaka, but it's not a keli that's muchan for any type of usage whatsoever. No, it has a very specific use. It's oimed lahasaka, and therefore you cannot just go ahead and use it to support a pot or to support a door. So again, if I read from the beginning of Chaf Aleph, Chaf Aleph on the bottom of Kuf Tezayin Amud Aleph, Deitzim lahasaka inoimdim v'loy l'davar acher. They're not considered muchan for anything else. V'lachein, and therefore, continues the Chavetz Chaim, afilu bebikas yevesha, even if we're talking about a dried out piece of wood, shenechayna lahasaka, which is mamish ready to be used for burning, so it's something that you would not think is muktzeh. It's mamish muchan for Yom Tov use, because on Yom Tov you're allowed to burn wood to cook. So this is a good dried out piece of wood. It has a Yom Tov use. Still, also l'taltalo l'tzarich davar acher, you're not allowed to be metaltalit for anything else, because it's oimed lahasaka and not for anything else. Ubechlal muktzeh hu lazeh, and for anything else it's considered muktzeh. V'das kama achroinim, however, it is the opinion of many achroinim, that the mechaber over here in this psak is following his previously stated opinion. The pasak b'simin Tov Tzadik Siv Daled, we saw earlier in Tov Tzadik Siv Daled, the muktzeh aser b'Yom Tov, that the mechaber takes a very hard line when it comes to muktzeh on Yom Tov. The case that we always speak about are the apples that were set aside for schera. You have a sack of apples that you're planning on selling. According to the Shita, like the mechaber, that are machmir on muktzeh on Yom Tov, even though the apple is eminently edible on Yom Tov, and it could be if you had a hankering for an apple, you would eat that apple. According to those that are machmir on muktzeh on Yom Tov, they say that level of muktzeh is aser on Yom Tov. Since you were masiach das from that apple to a certain extent, because you set it aside for schayra purposes, for commercial purposes, so you're not minastam, it wasn't on your mind to eat that apple. It's only pumped Yom Tov afternoon. You decided you're really in the mood of an apple, or you decided to make a recipe that suddenly needs an apple that you never anticipated making. Now you want to use the apple. But according to the mechaber, that apple would be muktzeh. And therefore, that's why the mechaber is saying over here that the bikas is muktzeh, because he's taking a very hard line on muktzeh. But according to those who take a more lenient look at muktzeh on Yom Tov, so then if you have a dried out piece of wood that's usable as firewood, so it has a Yom Tov use, so those shitas that are more makel in muktzeh on Yom Tov, they would hold that you're allowed to be metaltalid. Aval balacha, but how about if it's not a dried out piece of wood? How about if it's a wet, damp piece of wood that's not oimid lahasaka? Well then, since you're talking about a log that's not ru'uya lahasaka, it's not something that can be burned, aser, that would zicha be muktzeh the dinoi ka'avonim, because then it's like stam eitzim and avonim on Shabbos and Yom Tov that are muktzeh. If you want to use a stone, if you see a stone in your backyard on Shabbos afternoon, and you want to use it as a doorstop, you're not allowed to. Eitzim and avonim are muktzeh. There are things that are considered not to have any sort of Shabbos usage at all. You want to use it as a doorstop, you have to be making it before Shabbos. Before Shabbos, you have to designate it as a doorstop. Then it's muchan as a doorstop, and now it's not an even anymore, it's a doorstop. But stam, you go out to your backyard on Shabbos and Yom Tov, eitzim and avonim are muktzeh. The Kasa beBeis Meir, the Beis Meir writes, the B'shas Adchak yesh lismach lahakel bebikas yevesha. The Beis Meir concludes, and it sounds like the Chavetz Chaim is being machriya this way by bringing down the Beis Meir here. The Beis Meir writes that in the Shas Adchak, in a pressing circumstance, yesh lismach lahakel bebikas yevesha. If you do have a dried out clump of wood that is ru'uya lahasaka, you could be makel and you could use it to support a pot or for some other usage, and we would not consider it muktzeh. Okay, now we go to the top of Kuftez Zayin Amud Beis. We continue with the words of the Ramah. The Ramah says, Hago, Avol, if we're speaking about this bikas, so the Mechaber said you're not allowed to use this bikas to support a pot or support a door. Says the Ramah, Avol mutter litzlaispai. However, you're certainly allowed to use the clump of wood to cook with, to roast something with. The chol shekain shemutar lahasik by, and certainly you're allowed. Well, we'll see. You know what? Let's jump into the Mishnah Berurah right away. So the Ramah said, "Aval mutar litzlois by." You're allowed to roast something using this piece of wood. What does that mean that you're allowed to roast something? It does not mean that you're allowed to use it as fuel. Of course, you're allowed to use it as fuel. What does it mean that you're allowed to roast with it? Excuse me. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Chav Beis. Litzlais by, the Ramah says you're allowed to use this piece of wood to roast something with. Hainu shetoichiv by abasar litzliya. What the Ramah means over here is you're allowed to use the piece of wood as a spit. If you want to put a piece of meat on it and put it over the fire, you're allowed to do it. The Dafka, says the Chavetz Chaim, be'etz yavesh sheru'uya lahasaka. This is only true if it's an eitz yavesh, if it's a dried out piece of wood, that's ru'uya lahasaka. So take a look at what we're saying over here. This is a very interesting chap. What we're saying over here is, an eitz that's yavesh, a bikas that's dried out, that's usable as firewood, it's mutter for burning purposes, right? It's oimid lahasaka. So it's a muchan for burning. You're allowed to burn with it. Says the Ramah, not only are you allowed to burn with it, you're also allowed to use it as a spit. Why are you allowed to use it as a spit? You're not. The Mechaber said you're not allowed to use it to support a pot. So why are you allowed to use it as a spit? Says the Chavetz Chaim, Umitam. The reason is the Amrinon. We say Mali litzlois boy. What's the difference if we're using it as the spit to roast the meat on? Mali litzlois begachaltoi. Or if we're using it to roast the meat by burning it into a coal and using it as a heat source. What's the difference? If it's mutter for roasting the meat by burning it, it's also mutter for roasting the meat by using it as a spit. It seems that the bottom line is this clump of dried wood is a muchan for the cooking process. That's what it's muchan for. So it's a muchan to use it as a piece of firewood. It's also muchan to use it as a spit. Ava be'etz lach, but if you had a damp piece of wood, aser litzlois basar, you're not allowed to use it as a spit. Why? Because it's not muchan for anything. It's a stam piece of eitz, which is oimid lahasaka, right? That's what it's muchan for. It's muchan for burning, but it's damp. It's not dry, so it's not usable for burning. So it's not muchan for anything. If it's not muchan for anything, you can't use it as a spit. The dry one is ready to be burned, so it's muchan to be burned, so you could use it as a spit. However, when we say that you could use the bikas as a spit, that's only if you don't have to shape it, you don't have to sharpen it, you don't have to do anything to it to use it as a spit. But if you want to cut it down, shave it down, this and that, shape it, whatever, if you want to work on it to be misakin it, to turn it into a spit, so that it should be usable to roast something on it, also that would be aser kidul kaman b'siman taf kuf tes. Now let's go back up to the Ramah. Continues the Ramah. So you're allowed to use this dried out piece of wood as a spit. Continues the Ramah. The chol shekain shemuter lahasik by im shar eitzim. Certainly, you could take it and throw it into the fire. Even if it's not usable to burn on its own. Now, what kind of piece of wood is the Ramah talking about over here? Let's keep the flow of the Ramah over here. That's very critical. The Ramah said, if you have a dried out piece of wood that's roy to be burned, not only are you allowed to use it for burning, you're also allowed to use it as a spit. Because since it's muchan to be burned as fuel for roasting purposes, it's also muchan to be used as a spit for cooking purposes. Now, says the Ramah, the chol shekain, there's a kal v'chomer, shemuter lahasik boy, that you're allowed to burn it im sha'ar eitzim, together with other pieces of wood, afal gav she'eina roy lahasik b'fnei atzmai, even though the piece of wood that we're talking about cannot be burned on its own. What kind of wood are we talking about? If we're talking about the same piece of wood that the Ramah was talking about when he said you could use it as a spit, that's a dried out piece of wood. A dried out piece of wood is roy lahasik lifnei atzmai. That's perfectly usable to burn on its own. Of course you could burn it. You could burn it on its own. You could burn it together with other wood. So clearly the Ramah over here is not talking about a dried out piece of wood. Now the Ramah seems to have shifted gears, and now he seems to be talking about a damp piece of wood. So let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Chav Gimel. The Mishnah Berurah says, Avagav she'eina roy. What the Ramah wants to say over here is, Omitam zeh aser lehishtamish by l'shum davar. If we're talking over here about a piece of wood that's damp, and therefore, since it's a damp piece of wood, you're not allowed to use it for anything because it's not roy lahasaka, so it's not muchan for burning, so therefore it's not muchan at all, so you can't use it for anything. It's a muktzeh piece of wood. And you can't use it to support a door. You can't support it to support a pot. You can't use it for anything. The chanal, like we said before, but to burn it together with other dried pieces of wood, that you're allowed to do. V'hine, after din zeh ayri balachim, now we must be talking about a damp piece of wood, right? We're explaining now the halacha that the Ramah is saying is you have a damp piece of wood which is not muchan, even though really I told you that a damp piece of wood is muktzeh and you're not allowed to use it for anything. There's something you can use it for. If you have 10 pieces of good firewood and you throw them into a fire and you make a fire, but you want the fire to burn longer, you need more fuel. So now you want to take 5 pieces of wet wood and you want to throw them in to burn them together with the dry wood. That you're allowed to do because it's usable in that way, because it will burn eventually once there's a fire going that was made out of dry wood. V'hinei, after din zeh Ivy Balachim, now the Ramah is talking about wet wood. V'dina ditzliya, and the first halacha that the Ramah said, avamutter litzlais by, that was talking about dry wood. That was Ivy B'yaveshim dafka the Chanal. That was talking about dry wood. So the Ramah shifted gears here. In his first halacha, he was talking about dry wood. In his second halacha, he's talking about wet wood. There's still a kolshkein over here. You see, what's bothering the Chavetz Chaim is, what is this v'kolshkein shemutar lahasik by? You gave me one halacha, and you said a dry piece of wood that's mukhan for burning, you're allowed to use it as a spit. And then he says in Kal v'chomer that you're allowed to burn it with other pieces of wood. But over there, he's talking about wet wood. So he's saying like this. He's saying a dry piece of wood that's mukhan for burning, you could use as a spit. And Kal v'chomer, that a wet piece of wood that you're not allowed to use for anything, you're allowed to burn with other pieces of dry wood. What's the Kal v'chomer? So he explains what the Kal v'chomer is. The yoser bistaber lahater balach behesek gadol shosha yeveshim. It makes more sense to be matir, to render permissible burning a wet piece of wood together with a lot of other dry pieces of wood. Milahata yavesh litzlais by. That makes more sense. That's easier to understand than being matir, taking a dry piece of wood and using it as a spit. And what the Chavetz Chaim means is like this. Again, the Ramah told me 2 halachas. The first halacha was, you have a dry piece of wood that's mukhan for burning. So fine, I understand. You're allowed to burn it. No problem. The Mechaber told me a halacha that even though this dry piece of wood is mukhan for burning, you're not allowed to use it to support a pot. Why? Because it's mukhan for burning, but it's only mukhan for burning. It's not mukhan for anything else. Came along the Ramah, and the Ramah told me a chiddush. There is another thing you're allowed to use the dry piece of wood for. What is that? You could use it as a spit. Why? Because since it's mukhan for the cooking process to burn as fuel, it's also mukhan for the cooking process to use as a spit. Oh, then the Ramah tells me another halacha. Now there's a kal v'chomer. If you're allowed to use a dry piece of wood that's mukhan for burning, to use it as a spit, even though, does a spit have anything to do with burning? No, a spit has nothing to do with burning. So was this dry piece of wood mukhan to use as a spit? Not really. It was mukhan to use for burning. But still, we say that since burning is part of the roasting process, and spit is also part of the roasting process, so if it's mutter for this, it's mutter for that. If we're willing to say that, then kal v'chomer, a wet piece of wood. Now, a wet piece of wood, you can't burn right now. But what is a wet piece of wood designated for? It's oimed lahasaka. The wet piece of wood, its usage is burning. Now, it can't be burned right now because it happens to be wet. But if you have a fire going that you made out of dry wood, you could chuck the wet piece of wood into the fire and it will burn and it will act as fuel. Now that, if you could be matir using a dry piece of wood as a spit, which has nothing to do with burning, you zicha could be matir burning a wet piece of wood. It's oimed lahasaka if you're burning it together with other dry pieces of wood. So that's the explanation of the kol shekain. Even though the Ramah shifted gears, he went from dry wood to wet wood. So how are you making a kol shekain? There's the logic of the kol shekain. Okay. Now we go to Sif Dalet. Says the Mechaber. Lididan. For us, mutter levashel b'kideres chadashais b'yom tov. It is permissible to cook using brand new pots on Yom Tov. What's that play over here? Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah Katan Chav Daled. Lididan mutter, says the Chavetz Chaim. Hainu mishum. This halacha is given to us here by the Mechaber because The yesh oisrim, there are those that prohibit levashel b'kedera chadasha b'yom tov, to cook using a brand new pot on Yom Tov, k'moshe kasav harama, like we're going to see in the Ramah, mishum de bebishel arishon mischazekes hakedera, because when you cook for the first time using a brand new pot, you actually complete the forging process of the metal pot. The koydem habishel, because when you take that pot, that brand new pot, and you put it on the fire for the first time, nikerba plitas hamayim mibachutz, you could see moisture on the outside of the pot. And I'm not 100% sure what the Chavetz Chaim means over here. I'm not sure if what this means is that since you see moisture on the outside of the pot, that means that somehow moisture is exuding from the interior of the pot to the exterior of the pot. So somehow it's traveling through the walls, and that stops after the first cooking process because somehow it becomes denser. Or he means that there is moisture in the metal that exudes to the exterior of the pot the first time you cook it. So by that first cooking process, there's some residual moisture in the metal that exudes to the exterior. I'm not sure. But whatever it is, somehow this moisture on the exterior of the pot that you see the first time you cook in the pot is a siman that the forging process of the metal has not yet been completed. And therefore, since by cooking in the pot for the first time and firing it up for the first time, you're completing this forging process, the yesh bazeh mishum tikkun mana, this would be aser because of the malacha of makeh b'patish of tikkun mana. However, V'dasa Mechaber, the opinion of the Mechaber is Rabbeinu Yerucham, like the Shita of Rabbeinu Yerucham, the B'gderoi Shalanu, that with our pots, Nigmar Bishulon Kfar Eitz Ala Yoitzer, the forging process is completed by the one who makes the pot, by the manufacturer. V'lachein mutar l'didon lavashel b'gderech hadasha, and that is why the Mechaber says here that we are allowed to cook on Yom Tov using a brand new pot. Says the Ramah, Hagab. The Yesh Eisrin, however, there are those who say that this is prohibited. The Chein Aminig, and the Ramah says that's the minig. Unless you are in a pressing circumstance. And therefore, says the Ramah, since people often buy new pots before Pesach, and also the Chavetz Chaim is going to explain that the Ramah was addressing something that was specific to Pesach. Therefore, Mevashton ben Kaidim Yom Tov, you should cook in the pot at least one time, boil up a pot of water before Yom Tov, make sure to use the pot for the first time before Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut chafei, the Chein Aminig, Vadasa Magen Avram lechalek. The Magen Avram says that there is a difference. The Kelim HaMetzupin Shekaron Glazert, glazed pots that are glazed with some kind of glass. Ma'azikin Mayim B'toiv, they hold water completely. They're impervious right away from the beginning. Af Kaidem Bishul, even before you cook in them for the first time. V'lachein mutar lavashel ben b'Yom Tov af betchila, and therefore you're allowed to cook in them on Yom Tov even for the first time. V'aminig lahachmir hu rak b'kelim she'enam glazert, and the minig to rule stringently and not use them for the first time is only by unglazed pots. The chein kasvu sharei achrayim, and so write the rest of the achrayim. Ais kat l'chavav. If you have a pressing need, then you could use them even for the first time. What's considered a yidei atchak? For instance, if somebody forgot to cook in the pot before Yom Tov, and he doesn't have another pot, then certainly he is allowed to use the pot for the first time. Give me just 1 second here. I just want to see something in the Dirshu. No. Okay. You know what? I think we're going to stop over here, and in the next year, I will pick up fresh from the beginning of Siman Tov Kuf Gimel. Okay? Thank you so much for joining me for liimud HaTorah. The schus of liimud HaTorah should stand ganz Klal Yisrael in good stead. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshuas and Refuas, Parnasa to all those in need. The Rebbeinu Shalom should be Megan on ganz Klal Yisrael, Sai here, Sai in Eretz Yisrael, and the Rebbeinu Shalom should be Mazakas. We should be able to see the BS Girl Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu. Be well.